About how did the Enlightenment affect the lives of the people. So we talked about enlightened despots, we talked about Catherine the Great, and now we're going to talk about how the Enlightenment actually affected the lives of the people. So think about the question for the do now: why was the scientific revolution a movement for the upper class? Because remember, we said in class that it really wasn't something that affected the actual everyday lives of the people. Let's just kind of think about why that was true. So a couple of people I just want to focus on quickly. David Hume, who wrote The Natural History of Religion, 1755. And he said he believed that a belief in God rested on superstition and fear rather than reason. And remember, everything with the Enlightenment is all about reason. Another prominent enlightened thinker that we haven't really gotten too much detail on, Edward Gibbon. He wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 6 volumes, and he compared those problems with contemporary England and was trying to urge reforms. So today we're going to talk about how were the ideas of the Enlightenment spread. Now, one of the ways was through the salons. And today you're also going to be doing a reading on salon life. And you're also going to be doing a reading on the lost world of the London Coffee House to really kind of see what it was like at these gatherings and events. But remember, these salons would be run by prominent women, and they would invite different people over and bring all of these different people together to have these very, highbrow philosophical discussions about the world. And it was all run by women. And women played a really important role in this, even though a lot of the enlightened thinkers don't really believe in extending rights to women. It's the women that are bringing these people together. It's women that are making these conversations happen. It's women that are participating in these conversations. It's not like they didn't understand what these philosophers were saying. It's not like they hadn't read these books and were up on them as well. But it's really the salon in which that these ideas spread. And I think this goes on even into the 19th century. And if you went to Paris, you would want to try to visit one of these predominant salons. You would want to get one of these invitations. And the women that ran them were very well known and popular. A couple of Louis XV's mistresses. This other woman, oh my Lord, I forgot her name off the top of my head. She's going to be in the reading. My brain's not working today. But this was a way for the ideas to be brought to the people. There's Frederick the Great of Prussia playing his flute and forcing everyone to listen. But there you see, I think I've shown you this picture before about Frederick the Great, about his round dinner table at his palace at Sans Souci, allowing free thought and various different conversations to develop. Now, another way that the Enlightenment spread, because not everyone's getting invited to these salons, is through something called the encyclopedia. And so this man here, Diderot, was the person who edited the first encyclopedia. And he believed that all things must be examined, debated, investigated without exception and without regards to anybody's feelings. And he said, we will speak against senseless laws until they are reformed. And while we wait, we have to abide by them. But he writes the encyclopedia, or edits, I should say, the encyclopedia, which his goal was, it was in 17 volumes. And his goal was to bring all of these different ideas together so that people can have access to a far-ranging group of ideas. Remember I told you in class, before we had things like Google, everyone had a set of encyclopedias, and that's how you started doing any research for any project you had in class or any paper you had to write. You went to the encyclopedia first because we didn't have Google or Wikipedia or any of those things. So this encyclopedia was read widely throughout Europe and France. A lot of prominent enlightened philosophers contributed to the encyclopedia. People like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and many others contributed to this work. And so it started out in 17 volumes. It wound up growing to 28 volumes. It was supposed to be the complete cycle of knowledge. It was alphabetical, cross-referenced, and it was first published in 1751. And the idea, again, was to provide people with a vast realm of knowledge so they can, think for themselves, which is a very enlightened thought, and come up with things based on reason. And remember, I mentioned in the Catherine the Great video yesterday that Catherine the Great had a great correspondence with Diderot and was friends with Diderot. And she kind of saves his library because he had this a massive collection, but towards the end of his life, he kind of falls down on his luck financially, and he was going to have to start selling off his books. And she's like, that cannot happen. This has to stay together as a complete library. But I also mentioned that quote that she said about how Diderot writes on paper and she has to write on human flesh, which is far more ticklish. So she's kind of critical in some ways of Diderot, because when he's just sitting in his, in his home writing books saying about how government should rule, much different when you actually have to put it into motion itself. But here are some pages from Diderot's encyclopedia, some more pages from the encyclopedia. So you can see it covered a vast range of topics. And you can also see this is where the most subscriptions were to the encyclopedia. Now remember, France was the center of the Enlightenment, so it makes sense that France is going to be where most people are going to be getting these subscriptions. But even when he just put out the prospectus, like this is the idea of what he was going to do, like subscriptions were like being sold very rapidly. People were really excited about this idea of being able to have access to all this knowledge. So another way the Enlightenment affected the common people is the ideas of Beccaria. How would Beccaria's ideas affect the common people? So Beccaria in 1764 writes a book called On Crimes and Punishment. And he believed that laws of the monarchs and legislatures should conform with the laws of nature. He was against capital punishment. He was against torture. He felt that the intent for punishment should be to deter more crime, but also to rehabilitate the person who was the offender. So he felt that the purpose of law was to not play God and decide who lives or dies, but to secure the greatest good for the most people. And he also believed in something like a speedy trial and punishment. So thinking about our own criminal justice system, you can see that a lot of the ideas that our founding fathers had when they wrote the Bill of Rights were based on the ideas of Beccaria. No cruel and unusual punishment, trial by jury, and all of those different elements that make up the criminal justice system. All right. Women. So you should have done that reading. I assigned it last week on women in the Enlightenment. And so how did women gain power during the Enlightenment? So I said before, the salons were the main way. Here you can see this is an example of what a Parisian salon would look like. Finally, her name. I forgot what it was. Sorry, before. Madame Griffon. She was a young lady who was married to a much older man, and she ran these very large, popular salons. And then one day somebody asked her, like, oh, where's that old guy that always sits in the corner? He's not here, I noticed. And she's like, oh, yeah, that's my husband. He died. So because she was so much younger than her husband, so eventually when he passed on, she got to be a wealthy widow. And then she had power in her own right. And she was able to continue with these large salons. But you wanted to be associated with a fashionable salon because this increased your social status and the respectability of your ideas. And the women that ran them were well connected to major political figures. And at times they could help protect the philosophes if they had ideas that were contrary to, some of the government's ideas. So here, this is some of the more prominent ones. Suzanne Necker was in England, but Madame Griffon and Mademoiselle Julie Simpas was from France. It's another word of Madame Griffon and Susan Necker. Madame du Pompadour, which was Louis XV's, mistress, was also a very famous salonier. That's another image of her. There's lots of paintings of Madame du Pompadour. But we also see other female salons. Wealthy Jewish women created 9 of the 14 salons that were in Berlin. In Warsaw, Princess Sophia, I can't even say that last name, gathered around the reform leaders of Poland and Lithuania. Middle-class women in London used their salon to raise money and to try to publish women's writings because the philosophes were not feminists. They urged a better and broader education for women. They felt that their education was too religious, but there was really no radical changes proposed by any of the philosophes in women's social conditions. So Montesquieu, and I believe I mentioned this in class, he felt that women were not naturally inferior to men, thanks Montesquieu, and felt that women should have a wider role in society. He was also sympathetic to the fact that too much value he felt was being placed on women's appearances and that there was a prejudice against women as they aged. Despite that, he still retains the traditional view of marriage and family and expected men to be the dominant role in the marriage. And he supported, though, the right to divorce, and he opposed laws that were oppressive to women. So a little bit of gains. In the encyclopedia, there were ways to improve women's lives, but there was no real focus on how to actually make that happen. They emphasized the women's physical weakness and inferiority, and women were discussed in the context of the family, placing motherhood as the most important role and very little else. Rousseau, I mentioned him already, talked about him as far as his book Emily, when he believed how men and women should occupy separate spheres. And he felt that women in general were weaker and inferior, except in giving love. And he felt that they should be excluded from political life. But he felt that women played a very important role in the family and a role that could not be replaced by a man. And Rousseau did have a vast following amongst women, because even though he wasn't saying that women should get out of the house, he was making the role of wife and mother something that was noble, something that was necessary to society, and something that was fulfilling and had a purpose. But there were female philosophers. So this is Voltaire's mistress. And like I mentioned this when I talked about Voltaire, he learned a lot from her about science because she wrote about mathematics and physics, and she was a very prominent scientist. But kind of women are kind of romanticized in a lot of the art that comes out of this time period. The art, it's kind of interesting, the art of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, is either neoclassical, which is very kind of like almost emotionless and like mimicking the ideas of Greece and Rome, or you have this art, which is called Rococo. And the Rococo art was very decorative, and I like to say very like pink and fluffy and kind of like frivolous. And so there's usually like some sort of like playful like flirtation going on. So you have the sleeping girl and the boy sneaking up on her, and he's like tickling her neck while she's sleeping. This is a famous example of Rococo art. This is called Fragonard's The Swing. And you see the girl, she's swinging, and she's kicking her shoe off and flinging her leg out. And basically there's a man, if you can see him in the bushes, kind of like underneath, probably looking up her dress. So that's the art of the Rococo, very pink and frivolous and decorative, and kind of, putting women in this very like, flirtatious, frivolous kind of role. I'll keep saying frivolous. But in some ways in which the Enlightenment was popularized. So we see the gathering of elites in the salons. We also see this happening for the lower classes in the coffee houses. But the salon, the Enlightenment was very urban and urbane, so cosmopolitan. I've talked about that word before. People are very worldly, reading newspapers and the latest books and kind of being more aware on what's going on in the world. We also see that literacy goes up during the Enlightenment, so about 80% for men and 60% of women. But books were very expensive. So people would share books. So you'd have about 20 people reading one book. So a book would get passed around, shared by a bunch of people, or books would be accessed through, again, the coffee houses where people could get access to all the newspapers without actually having to pay for them. That's how people got to have access to these things. But novels and plays became very popular. Journals and memoirs became popular. And so more people were beginning to read during the Enlightenment. Lending libraries began to be developed. You'd pay like a subscription and you'd be able to go borrow books from the lending library. So if we see here, you can see kind of like the increase in France versus Germany. So literacy rate in the cities in France in 1683 was 51%. It goes up to 60%. The rural areas, the increase in literacy is much more dramatic, going from 37 to 73, and for women going from 7% to 46%. So women aren't as literate as men, but we are seeing a large increase in that. So some of the most read books of the time were books by Newton, two of Locke's books, book by Montesquieu, Rousseau's books, Diderot's. So we could see these are the most popular books that were being read during this time period. So Mary Wollstonecraft, we'll talk about her last. So why does Mary Wollstonecraft feel women should be educated? So Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the few female philosophers that we have. In 1792, she writes A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is kind of a play on the French Revolution's issuing of a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, because she feels that women should also have rights. She felt that the traditional roles of women were too narrow, It narrowed women's vision and it limited their experience. She felt that basically women were kept as pretty much like slaves of men when confined just to the home. And they were victims of male tyranny because they could never achieve their own moral or intellectual identity. And she felt that denying a good education to women was essentially impeding the progress of society, because how can you not educate half of your population? That's half of your population that can be innovating, can be thinking, that can be contributing to society. So she felt that that was a great sin, that women were not getting an education and being able to take care of themselves and support themselves. She also, by the way, is the wife of a prominent English poet named Shelley, and their daughter, Mary Shelley, is the author of Frankenstein, and she's the creator of the genre of science fiction. This is a picture of Wollstonecraft. So, what is the legacy of the Enlightenment? So the democratic revolutions that began in America in 1776 and then continued in other places like Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris, were all rooted in the Enlightenment. Reform, democracy, and republicanism had been placed irrevocably on the Western agenda. And remember, talking about with AP World, not just the West, because then it also spreads to places like Haiti and places like South America. So we see that new forms of civil society arise, things like the clubs and the salons, private academies, lending libraries, all these different things. And the 19th century conservatives are going to blame the Enlightenment for what they call the egalitarian disease. Basically, everyone just thinks that they have rights, and the aristocracy would not agree with that. It established a materialistic tradition based on an ethical system derived from this idea of nature and reason. It theoretically endowed with full civil and legal rights. The individual could come into existence and be a political and social force to be reckoned with. Again, completely dismantling the idea of divine right rule and absolute power. So, do you think the Enlightenment actually really significantly changed the lives of the people? Think about that, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.